It is a very special anniversary today. Today, the Fab Four themselves played their first York gig. The Beatles actually performed in York 4 times in 1963, always at the Rialto Theater on Fishergate, and they also played in Harrogate at the Royal Hall and at Scarborough's Futurist Theatre. Yeah, big fans of the North. But their first gig in our part of the county and country took place 60 years ago today, when John, Paul, George and Ringo were on tour with Helen Shapiro. Now, Helen was actually off sick and missed the show, so if you were lucky enough to be at that show or to see the Beatles on another occasion here in North Yorkshire, then please do get in contact. I'd love to hear from you. 0800 111 48 49. Let's chat to a couple of people who did see the Beatles play in York. Tony Parkin lives in London now but grew up in York. Morning, Tony.
Morning.
And also Graham Metcalf from York and still lives in the city. Morning, Graham.
Good morning, Georgey.
So, Tony, which gigs did you go to?
Well, I went to both the Helen Shapiro one and then the Roy Orbison one in the May.
And what was it like?
I hate to be a bit of a downer, but the Helen Shapiro night was a real disappointment.
Ooh!
Because I was a big Beatles fan because you didn't get to hear much music, of course, and the only time you got to hear the Beatles was on like the Saturday Club or Here We Go, this sort of 5 o'clock show on the light programme. I went to see the Helen Shapiro thing. Well, first of all, Helen Shapiro, who I quite liked, as you said, wasn't on. So, I mean, we did get Billy Davis singing Tell Him, which was like pretty good. But the trouble was the Beatles were 5th on the bill, so they only got quarter of an hour. And they didn't do a great set in that it was not stuff like we'd got used to listening to them on the radio doing all this rock and roll stuff to Chuck Berry and Little Richard stuff. And then you got there and they did Taste of Honey and things. So it was early on. They were followed by people like Kenny Lynch and so on, who I was never a huge fan of, nice bloke though he was. And then the end of the night, it was Danny Williams singing Moon River, so it was hardly a Beatles crowd. So I came away a bit deflated.
A very disappointing night. What about you, Graham? I'm hoping it's going to get better than the poor Tony's experience.
Yes, I agree with most of what Tony said there. A bit of a disappointment, really. And when the Beatles did come on, the place just went wild. You know, you couldn't hear a thing, really, because of all the girls just screaming. It was just a crazy, crazy night. But I say, a bit of a disappointment. Once the Beatles had been on, we just completely lost interest. There was nothing, nothing. They were good artists, all of them. Danny Williams and Kenny Lynch, we were familiar with. They'd been on TV quite a lot back in that time. But we'd only gone to see the Beatles, and we weren't even bothered about Helen Shapiro. But but then I went again. I think I went 3 times.
Yeah.
I went to see the Chris Montez Tommy Rowe night, which was only a few weeks later. Unbelievable. They did 4 gigs in a year in York.
And what was it like when you knew they were coming, Graham, to York? The Beatles were coming.
Great excitement, yeah.
Really?
Well, we were young lads. I was 16, just fresh out of school. Already had a band. Playing in a band that we formed at school. Purely to play Shadows instrumentals, really. Didn't want to be a singer. But then the Beatles came along, and they were such a breath of fresh air. We'd heard them on the radio, started buying their records, and we just had to play that music. They formed a band to play.
Yeah.
And I started singing.
and Tony, what about you when you heard the Beatles were coming? I mean, what state of excitement were you in?
I was still at school, and so I just had a part-time job. And we'd been following the Beatles. It's really hard to explain because it was so rare because there was no needle time at the time, but they didn't allow you to play lots of records. So what we heard on the 5 o'clock show on the light programme was live recordings of the Beatles. It sounds silly, live recording, but I mean, it was really fresh. It was full of energy. it just blew us away. Because I say, if you think at the time, the charts were full of people like Kenny Lynch and various other people of that ilk, singing novelty songs. I mean, Billy Davis, that was on with them, had done a novelty number, the previous number, with a guy called Mike Sarn. So, these were not exciting. And suddenly the Beatles came in out of nowhere, and we were all a bit too young to remember the rock and roll the first time round, the Chuck Berrys and the what have you originals. But to get these guys coming on with this energy, and that just blew you away.
But also,
absolutely.
The pair of you can lay claim you have seen the Beatles.
Oh, yes. 3 times in my case. But
there you go.
That was 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And I never saw them again.
Listen, thank you so much for sharing. Go on, Tony.
Tell you what, we should say about the Roy Orbison night was something else again, though. They did Twist and Shout. They did I Saw Her Standing There and Please, Please Me. And that was magic night. So having had a bit of a disappointment, the Roy Orbison night was amazing.
Pulled
One of
it
the
out
best
the
concerts
bag.
I've ever been.
Oh, superb.
Yeah,
Tony.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much, Tony Parkin and Graham Metcalf. They were there in the 60s seeing the Beatles for the first time in York. Have you? Did you see them in Yorkshire, in Scarborough, in Harrogate? 0800 111 48 49 when you call me.